Hey, beautiful humans. I'm Sukie Baxter, and welcome. Today, I want to talk to you about the controversy around polyvagal theory. So, if you don't know, a paper recently came out that called polyvagal theory untenable. That means that it cannot be supported. It doesn't stand up to scrutiny. Basically, it's not real. This is destabilizing for those of us like myself who are clinicians, practitioners who have grounded our work in polyvagal theory. Now, it's not a shock. I wrote a whole article about this and I talked about some earlier papers that came out, and I did have a bit of an inkling that this might happen at some point. If you want to read that article, I'll link to it in the description box below. But I do feel like us practitioners have been in a bit of a polyvagal theory echo chamber. We have learned about polyvagal theory in our education, in our training, sometimes in graduate programs, and of course, it's everywhere on social media. My own work included, right? Because I have shared this as well. And we keep repeating it to each other. Now we have 39 of the world's leading experts in neuroscience, neuroanatomy, vertebrate evolution, vagus nerve research, physiology, who are coming forward to really share what the science shows. I read both the critique of polyvagal theory and Porges's rebuttal. And the rebuttal is very self-referential. Most of the citations in there are of Porges's own work. So I thought it would be really helpful and important to have somebody talk to us a little bit more about what the science shows, what we know, and what we don't. So I invited Dr. Paul Grossman, who's the lead author of the paper Polyvagal Theory is Untenable, to talk with me, and he so kindly and so generously agreed to come on and share his perspective, not only about the science, but about this whole conversation, where it's coming from. Because it didn't just start this year. This is a conversation that's been going on for quite a while. Dr. Grossman has an extensive resume, so let me just share a couple of highlights with you. He's a psychologist and a psychophysiologist with 4 decades of research on cardiorespiratory autonomic physiology. He served as the research director at the Lone Cardiovascular Research Institute at Harvard and as the research director at the University of Basel Hospital in Switzerland. He's also the director for the European Center for Mindfulness in Freiburg, Germany. And that really matters because he is someone who honors and validates that mind-body connection that you and I know, we observe, we see it every day. So he's not here to tell us that our work doesn't work. He's here to share what the science is actually showing so that we can move forward as practitioners with a better understanding and hopefully be more effective and more able to support and help our clients. All right, so without further ado, let's get into it. Dr. Grossman, welcome. Thank you so much for being here and talking with us.
Well, thanks very much for having me too. And I read your Substack piece, and I found it a very brave thing to write at this particular point in time.
Well, thank you. That means a lot coming from you, and I appreciate it. And I am looking forward to talking with you further because I think that there's a lot of information that would be helpful for us as practitioners and clinicians about really understanding the science of polyvagal theory, why we need to understand the science of polyvagal theory or what isn't polyvagal theory, and why it's important for us to understand what you wrote in the article that you and your co-authors put out about the science, why that's helpful for us as practitioners. So
I'll do my best.
Yeah, I'm sure that you'll be able to shed some light on it. Let's just jump in and tell me a little bit about your background and how you came to study the autonomic nervous system. So what brought you into this?
Well, I did my PhD in psychology and developmental psychology and psychobiology. And that was a long time ago. I think I did my PhD and finished my PhD in about 1980. And then I immediately was interested in the relationships between cardiovascular function and respiratory function, how breathing and heart went together or go together. And I came upon this phenomenon, respiratory sinus arrhythmia, RSA, as it's often called these days. And that phenomenon fascinated me because it was exactly what I was interested in. It was coordination of breathing and heart rate. And I pursued that area for the last long time, 45 years, basically. And it went from just this interest in terms of connections between the breath and the heart to the autonomic nervous system, and early on, respiratory sinus arrhythmia was lighted upon as a measure of, or an index of cardiac parasympathetic control of heart rate.
Can
And
you just, because I know there's going to be a lot of people watching this who may not know what that means, can you define that? You said it
well,
was, say it again, respiratory
respiratory sinus arrhythmia.
sinus
Do you want me
arrhythmia.
to
Yeah, just can
describe
you
what
just
it
give us
is?
the layman's version of what that is?
It's a very simple phenomenon, especially for people your age or a bit older, or certainly a bit younger. If you take your pulse and you feel your heartbeat, and you breathe very slowly in and out, you'll notice that there's a speeding of the heart during inspiration and a slowing of the heart during expiration. That's the heart rate variation or heart rate variability that's associated with breathing. And that's called respiratory sinus arrhythmia.
And
It's
what was it about what was it about that was interesting to you? Like, why did that pique your curiosity and become something you wanted to study?
oh, primarily early on um, because it seemed to be also related to the parasympathetic nervous system and vagal control of the heart. The parasympathetic nervous system is one of the two branches of the autonomic nervous system, and the the tenth cranial nerve. There are a bunch of cranial nerves, but the tenth cranial nerve is the only one that kind of goes lower than the neck and jaw, and down to all the organs of the body. And there was an article in 1975, I think, by Katona and G, and they used dogs to estimate vagal control of heart rate at different levels of vagal control. They did an invasive experiment where they could look at whether respiratory sinus arrhythmia increased as vagal control of the heart increased, and decreased as vagal control of the heart decreased. And that was, I wasn't the only one who became fascinated by that possibility. And then I developed all sorts of hypotheses that very often turned out not to be true, and I had to adjust my science accordingly. And I was particularly interested in at that time in the world of psychophysiology, the world of academic researchers, scientific researchers who were interested in relationships between body and mind, and particularly between the heart and psychological functioning. All the Pretty much all the research was focused on the sympathetic nervous system. So I thought, we can. There's all this whole other branch. Let's explore that, and that's kind of what I've been doing at least with part of my professional life for the last 45 years. Kind of obsessional, actually.
So you've been at this for quite a while.
I've been asked this for quite a while. Yeah.
Okay. And
Does
so
that,
how
does
did
that give
you,
you an idea of what respiratory sinus arrhythmia is? It's a
yeah, and I think we
relatively
can delve into that a little bit more as we go. Before we do that though, I'm curious how you first encountered polyvagal theory and what prompted you to delve into the science behind it a little bit more, because it sounds like it's adjacent to the work that you were already doing.
definitely it was. Um, there were very few people who were really interested in the parasympathetic branch of the nervous system in the 80s, and Steve Porges was one of them, and of course I kept up with his work, and he kept up with mine, and I was actually at the annual conference of psychophysiologists when he presented the polyvagal theory. And that's when I first became kind of skeptical of it. But that's another aspect.
We'll delve into that a little bit. I'm also curious, why do you think no one was looking at the parasympathetic nervous system? Like what was it about the sympathetic nervous system that seemed important and people were disregarding the parasympathetic nervous system?
Well, I think that, the sympathetic nervous system has been long attributed to kind of stress-related responses and fight or flight. It's not also not completely accurate, um, um, but I think psychophysiologists were interested in, particularly in stress responses and negative responses, as so much of psychology is interested in what happens when things go wrong, as opposed to when things go right. It's not an orientation that is always desirable, but that's historically been the way things go.
Okay, so they were trying to figure out what was causing the symptoms that were problematic without really looking at the balance between parasympathetic and sympathetic. Is that accurate?
That's relatively that's accurate. And they thought that the heart rate increases were predominantly sympathetic in nature, and in many cases they are. But that's kind of shifted the orientation away from the other branch. I mean, it's a lot to study to really figure out what's going on in both sympathetic and parasympathetic branches of the autonomic nervous system, and then to link it up to behavior and to link it up to higher brain function. There's a lot of things to consider.
Right. And it sounds like a very holistic approach where you're really looking at sort of I guess, the physiological underpinnings of behavior. Is that a good summation?
Physiological underpinnings, or maybe correlates of behavior. Maybe, we don't, it's hard to know what causes what sometimes too, um, but definitely trying to latch on to, how does our body seem to function under different behavioral conditions? That was the orientation of and still is the orientation of psychophysiology. Sometimes, people confuse association, correlation, and causation. This also been a problem in psychophysiology, but I think that's beyond the scope of our discussion today.
Right. I would be interested, but yeah, probably more than we're really looking into today. So you wrote a paper, which is why we're having this conversation, and you had 39 co-authors that were at institutions around the world. And I'm curious how that paper came together. So how did you go about selecting the contributors and what started all of this?
Can I give you a little history to that too?
Yeah,
A
absolutely.
couple of years ago, um, a group of renowned physiologists published a paper in Nature reviews, and in the process of preparing the paper, I was delighted that they invited me to also participate. I hadn't expected that, but it came out of the blue for me. But I got an invitation to be a co-author, and as the first psychologist, there was one other psychologist that joined in later, um, um, and I watched the process evolve over time, and it was a very smooth process. It was about respiratory sinus arrhythmia, the paper, and um, about certain critical issues that also ran counter polyvagal theory, but it never really named polyvagal theory in the paper itself. Um, and th- then uh, after our paper was published, I read a new review of polyvagal theory by Steve Porges, and it was published in the same journal that we published our paper in, and I thought, well, I still had some problems with the polyvagal theory. The problems continued, and with his depiction of physiology, the actual physiology underlying that, and I'd published several papers already in 2007, two papers with a well known evolutionary physiologist, and also with a couple of really well known psychologists. But basically, I've been more or less solo, the kind of the lone ranger in this whole issue of critique of the polyvagal theory. And after the Nature Neuroscience publication, I got the idea maybe I could do that again. I could replicate the process, and instead of being the sole author of another critical comment on the polyvagal theory, that by enlisting other people, or inviting them to collaborate on a new publication that was a critical evaluation of the polyvagal theory, but also focused on this particular article by Steve Porges. So it was in a critique of his own words in that article, that it would have much more impact, and surely it has. So what I did is, I started to invite all the most the highest caliber, most respected physiologists of the autonomic nervous system and related evolution scholars, and I didn't really know what to expect. I thought maybe some of them would go along with the ride, and some of them wouldn't. But I invited 39 of the most renowned physiologists. I wasn't looking for people who were pro or contra polyvagal theory. I just wanted the creme de la creme, and surprisingly, I got them all. The only one who I didn't who turned down the offer, still on the basis of what I sent him and what I sent to everyone else, said, "Well, I don't have the time, but I think you're absolutely right." So 39 out of 39. And what
Mhm.
I did is
So just to
just under
recap. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah.
what I did is I sent everyone an invitation to participate in this as co-authors, as authors. I sent them a very rough first draft that I had written of my own critique of polyvagal theory, and of this focusing upon the words of Steve Porges, and made it very clear that that this was just a first draft, and this was a collaborative effort. And then I also sent them the article from Steve Porges that had been published as well. And so on that basis, they pretty much all decided to join the ride, basically.
Mm. Okay. So you weren't looking for people who were going to agree with you, as you said. You were looking for people to chime in with their expertise.
I was looking for the experts. I didn't care if they agreed with me or not. I figured from my long career in the area of autonomics, neuroscience, and parasympathetic nervous system, and my relatively consistent and long collaborations with physiologists in Holland and in the United States and in Germany, various countries. I figured that probably most of them would agree with me. Would agree with what I was saying, because I was just living off of my knowledge of physiology, which seemed to be very much at odds with what many psychologists were thinking at the time.
Got it.
But I definitely didn't cherry pick any. I mean, these people are really the top people in the field. All you have to do is do a Google scholar search or look in PubMed, and you'll see that that's just the way it is.
Right. So they have published research that's peer reviewed. They've been doing this for a long time.
It's not only that, but they're like presidents of the International Autonomic Nervous System Association. They organize things. They're really the top people in the field, no doubt about it.
Okay. And I know that some of your co-authors had research that was cited by Porges as supporting polyvagal theory, and that came up in your paper. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Let's see yeah, I can speak to it. There were several of my co-authors that were cited in the Porges original paper, and also in his recent reply or response to our paper. And of course, I conferred with them to make sure that my judgment was correct. But all of them said that they were misrepresented by Porges, as if they supported the polyvagal theory when they did not. And to my surprise, he did the same thing with the reply that he just wrote. So that's very often the articles that they cite have nothing to do with his points at all, and they're just totally addressing other issues.
Right.
I think that's a valuable thing to bring up. If you're going to rely on the publications of the seminal publications of certain physiologists, I think it's imperative that you really you really present their arguments that are in support, and not just refer to them briefly as supporting the paper, the tenets of polyvagal theory or any other theory that you're writing about.
Right. And so to sum it up, he's saying there's research that supports my theory. And the people who did the research are saying, well, actually, that's not, like, the way you're interpreting this is not what the research shows. And these are not grad students or early career researchers who might not fully understand the depth of their work, right? Like, these people are preeminent researchers and leaders in the field.
Yeah, I mean, one of them is Mike Spire, K.M. Spire. He's been in this field for 60 years, and he's one of the most knowledgeable, most accomplished, most well respected people in the field, and the other people as well. The other few people. I'm talking about 3 or 4 people at this point.
Mhm. And so also, this is not, or at least it doesn't sound to me like this is a case of people, because this does happen, right? Where you've got people in a field and they say, well, this is the way it is. And then something new comes along and people will dig in their heels and refuse to look at new evidence. But this is not that, right? Like this is actual research that is being interpreted in one way. And they're saying, no, that's a misinterpretation of the work that I've done.
Exactly.
Okay. I think that's
Exactly.
important.
I think, I think certainly I'm not, all these people are doing research that's very peripheral to psychology. And they would just like the psychologists to get it right when it comes to understanding the physiology. That's why they joined forces with me with this paper that co-authored that and they took the time to work on the paper and to improve it greatly. So I think they're very happy to have this opportunity, but it's not something that they would ordinarily seek out by themselves. So they don't have any kind of um, um, conflicts or how do you say it? Fights to begin with psychologists. They're really outside of the psychological framework, but they don't like to have their ideas distorted either.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so they, I assume, felt it was important because there was erroneous information being put out, and they wanted to correct the record.
And that's it. I mean, we're talking about a certain knowledge base that's really well accepted throughout autonomic physiology. They have their differences about things, but not about these things. It was incredibly easy for these 38 physiologists and evolution specialists to agree about certain things. There are lots of stuff that they don't agree about, but it was not at this level, and that to me implies that there is kind of a consensus. We didn't promote this piece as a consensus statement because there are certain formal criteria that you have to adhere to. But that might happen in the future. But now we can still say that in general there is a consensus among physiologists, autonomic specialists that is clearly in contradiction to the tenets, the physiological tenets of the polyvagal theory.
Okay. And so one of the common responses to the paper is that it is misrepresenting polyvagal theory, that the critique is of a simplified version rather than the theory that Porges is trying to articulate. So how do you and your co-authors respond to that?
Well, this is a critique that I've gotten previously as well from earlier papers. I think my co-authors in 2007 didn't really understand it. I didn't understand this critique either. In my 2023 paper, got this critique as well. I didn't really fathom it, but because of that, I and we thought it would be a good idea if we actually focused on latest overview of the polyvagal theory by Porges and used quotes from him from from his article as points that we would disconfirm, basically. And that's exactly what we did. So I still don't really comprehend. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me what this argument is all about. We took, I think, 17 or 18 quoted statements from Porges and provided evidence against them.
Right. So you're quoting him verbatim and then addressing his exact words.
Right. I mean, his exact concepts, the concepts that come from the words. I don't think we could have misrepresented his concepts 18 times. And if we didn't understand his concepts, I'm not sure how anybody else would, who was less well informed about the autonomic nervous system and the vagus nerve. So it still doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me to bring this argument. And additionally, if these points were presented in an overview, kind of a summary of polyvagal theory as major points, it's hard to understand how disconfirming them or making them untenable, presenting evidence that makes them untenable, could be some sort of misrepresentation or oversimplification of the theory. And I'm open for other arguments in this regard, but nobody else really is. And Steve Porges in his reply also doesn't really give me any convincing arguments.
Right. And in his rebuttal paper, I noted that most of the work cited was his own work. It was very self-referential.
It is. I mean, that's one of the, I think that's one of the issues that I have with the polyvagal theory, that the basic literature is derived from either Steve Porges or from Porges and his colleagues, or from people who actually assume that the polyvagal tenets are scientifically accurate, and that kind of creates a closed chamber that people can develop their expertise within the polyvagal framework. But if the framework is flawed, then there's a huge problem. And I think that's what we've been addressing.
Yeah. Yeah, you've mentioned that it's a bit like a polyvagal echo chamber. Can you say more about that? Because your perspective on that is very interesting.
Yeah, I think, psychologists and therapists and even psychophysiologists don't have a huge amount of experience in physiology. Even psychophysiologists, we get our training more or less hands-on, basically. When we decide we want to measure heart rate or heart rate variability or breathing, then we buy a few electrodes and we do it, and we read a few things, and very often it doesn't go much farther. And with psychologists and therapists is even much less. You can't blame them for not knowing about physiology and or details of physiology, like what's happening with the vagus nerve, but they don't really have any kind of knowledge base, so to speak. And then a theory comes into psychology that seems attractive, that holds together fairly well, that's presented very often in a very confident way, as though the assertions were not just hypotheses, but as facts. And then people start believing it, and then it creates a whole reverberation chamber, basically, of um, polyvagal or vagal. It doesn't even have. There are other vagal theories too in psychology that are equally tenuous, I think. But it creates a situation in which there's a whole industry of academic industry of vagal researchers in psychology who have limited knowledge themselves that serve as uh, peer reviewers of um, other authors who publish in the vagal domain, and it creates this whole framework where there are new vagal hypotheses based on these different vagal theories, and they bounce off of each other, and books are written, and there are new therapies that are developed from them, and it creates a kind of closed space, an insulated bubble that's very, very hard to break if you're out if you're especially if you're a psychologist that's outside that bubble, like me. So for years, I published my stuff, and I never really could break through the bubble. And now I think with having all these experts, the there's some few holes in the bubble anyhow. So something else is coming in.
And so, I mean, I'm a practitioner, right? I have worked with people one-on-one. I work with groups now. I have grounded my work in polyvagal theory. Obviously, I'm making a pivot because I'm understanding that, okay, the science is clear. Like, this is not as, this isn't what I thought it was. So I'm going to expand my learning and seek new explanations. But why is that important for us to do? And this is a question I ask because I get from a lot of practitioners and clinicians as a response to the article that I wrote. Well, if the work works, then what's the harm in teaching polyvagal theory or using polyvagal theory as a framework when we're working with our clients, even if it's not right?
Well, I think there are different issues. First of all, I think if you're claiming that you're working from a scientific basis and you're scientific, you're presenting concepts or explanations to patients, vulnerable people that are inaccurate, then I think there's an ethical problem there, just inherently. You shouldn't be dishonest to your patients. I don't think that's a good idea. I don't think it's a good idea, not only in terms of the ethics involved, but I think it's not a good idea because of the harm it could conceivably do. For instance, let's say the New York Times or the New Yorker, or here where I am in Holland, the local newspapers, um, um, you know, begin to get interest in this topic, and they say, well, polyvagal theory has been debunked. This already happened with the Australian Medical Association in an interview that I gave 2 weeks ago. And let's say you're a patient and you've gone through this polyvagal theory and you thought, well, it did you some polyvagal informed therapy, and you thought it did you some good. But then you find out that the theory has been debunked. That could have a very negative adverse effect upon the therapy that you've gone through. So there's
Why would that have an adverse effect?
Well, I think if you begin to think, oh well, that it's all nonsense, then we'll see. Where am I with this all? I think you begin to doubt whether the therapy really might have worked or not, especially if you're not totally in another space than you were before. which is, very often the case with people who go through therapy. They don't get, usually it's not a matter of feeling cured, it's a matter of adjusting better to life. And then you find that somehow your explanation is inaccurate. It's totally one that could make me feel fooled anyhow, and make me doubt a doubt about the theory and the treatment, and I don't think that's going to have a positive effect anyhow. And then there are other elements of telling people that their nervous system works in a certain way, that it doesn't work. It creates the idea of that I hear all the time in among clinicians, is that the polyvagal theory provides people with understanding that brings body and mind closer together. And I think if this theory is a mental fiction, then you're not bringing body and mind closer together. You're bringing the two farther apart. And then there's a whole issue of the different practical and theoretical aspects of the treatment, and what's been told about your trauma, for instance. That during dissociation or emotional freezing, that you have incredible bradycardia. Your heart rate slows down so that it could be potentially lethal. And when this seems to be a fiction, based on all the evidence that we have, and you could I can imagine, or one could imagine that could create also a certain level of distress and fear for people when they're in an emotional freezing situation, or when they're dissociating. That's also not very, very helpful for their healing. So I think there are various aspects of why you wouldn't want to provide that information to patients or to clients, and why not provide other information that's accurate? That seems to be a much more sensible way of doing things. It's not like we know nothing about these phases or states of trauma that are represented in polyvagal theory. We know quite a lot, and there's quite a lot of scientific evidence that indicates what really is happening. Why not rest upon that? It might be more complicated, but you can still simplify it to the extent that patients and therapists can understand it.
Right. I think from a clinical standpoint, so I've been through this a little bit, because I started with hands-on body work, and the explanations given for how that work was working were inaccurate. And as I began to understand that and began to look for alternate explanations, I found myself feeling more confident in my work.
Sure.
And the work itself changed. It became more humane, in my opinion, because what I had studied is called Rolfing. And many, many years ago, Rolfing was a very aggressive type of body work. And as we have come to understand that we're not actually like ripping apart fascial adhesions, and that there is some sensory component there, the work has shifted. It's become more enjoyable, both for the practitioner and the client, and I think more effective. At least I found it to be more effective. Nothing's effective for every single person, but I felt like I could help more people more reliably when I actually had a more accurate understanding of the processes at play. And I don't yet know what that looks like for letting go of polyvagal theory in this work, but I do think that something will shift. At least that's my hope.
Things can shift. I think there are explanations that are plausible and that can inform people in their lived experiences. There's also a huge amount of variation of physiological responses from one person to the other, and we can only present a kind of global picture of the average response during a traumatic event. We don't have the individual data that allows us to see how different the responses can be. Uh, but but uh, but for those of people who really would like to have that physiological explanation, I think that there's adequate science there to provide a reasonable explanation, and what I do see as a, a kind of a benefit from polyvagal theory and from other theories is they do acknowledge the fact that these physiological events do happen. That that dorsal vagal shutdown is really a shutdown that is physiological. It's not dorsal vagal, but there's something physiologically happening, and that kind of acknowledgement for patients can be very helpful. That they're not just totally in their heads, and it's a psychological problem that they have, but there is
Right.
something physical going on.
Yeah.
But it's kind of relabeling those physical events that's important. And on the other hand, all the other stuff in polyvagal informed psychotherapy is largely comes from much earlier research,
Yeah.
um, from Maslow's hierarchy of human needs in 1943, or from John Bowlby's work on attachment in the 1960s, that very much influenced me in those times and later on as well. And then there are things that have been attached on to the polyvagal theory, like mindfulness. It's this been around for millennia,
Right.
and yoga also. So the superstructure, the psychological structure of these treatments very often has very little to do with the labels that people give for what's happening physiologically. I think it could be easily adapted, in fact. And uh, I'm writing a couple of papers with a couple of different people that to approach, well, like, what now, basically.
I
How
look
we?
forward to that.
Yeah, I'm not sure how successful they will be, but we'll do our best.
Yes. Yeah. Well, and I'd love to chat a little bit about the science. So we mentioned early on respiratory sinus arrhythmia and what that is. So, and my understanding is that that is the synchrony between breathing and heart rate in very, very simple layman's terms. Is that a good?
Yeah, that's heart rate gets faster during inspiration, slows down during expiration, and it's basically the difference between heart rate during inspiration, heart rate during expiration.
Right.
It's just that simple.
And and so what significance, like what does that tell us and what does it not tell us? And also I'm curious, what is the relationship between respiratory sinus arrhythmia and what so many people have come to know as heart rate variability or HRV?
Okay, heart rate variability is a general term that has to do with all the different kind of rhythmic and non-rhythmic variations that happen in heart rate um, um, over a course of a period of time. So there are rhythms that are much slower than breathing. Every 30 seconds, every minute, or diurnal rhythms, or there are probably monthly rhythms that you can track too. Respiratory sinus rhythmia is one form of heart rate variability. It's actually in our Nature paper we make the plea for changing the name of respiratory sinus arrhythmia to respiratory heart rate variability. It's a change in heart rates that occurs during inspiration and expiration from one breath to another, and that change really has something to do with with some aspect of vagal control. It's not the vagal control over average heart rate during a period of time. It's the average. The um, it depicts the changes that happen from breath to breath. You have average heart rate, which is like the depth of a lake, and then you have the wind blowing, and there's some waves that happen in the lake. That's the waves. Those are the waves on the lake, so to speak.
Okay.
Um, and those waves are made by or influenced by the parasympathetic nervous system and the vagus nerve, and that means that certain neurons in the brainstem that are responsible for this coordination between breathing and heart rate are responsible for these changes in that we characterize as respiratory sinus arrhythmia. I don't know how clear that was, but so
Well,
for instance,
it sounds like it's more complex than our smartwatches have led us to believe.
Let me just make another analogy.
Sure. Yeah.
And we'll get to the smartwatch. I think back in the 60s, there was a paper about gating of the vagus to the heart. And
What do you mean by gating?
Gating, like there's a gate,
Uh-huh.
a gate that opens and closes. And the gate opens during expiration and closes during inspiration.
Okay.
And so that you have during expiration of heart rate slowing, which means that there's more vagal input to the heart, and during inspiration the gate closes, and this opening and closing of the gate is mediated by certain brain centers in the brainstem that are related to breathing, actually. And but this is just a very specific influence on that's coming from the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is like a cable that has 100,000 plus fibers, and those fibers are connected to different neurons in the brainstem, and those different neurons in the brainstem have different functions. Some of them have to do with heart rate. Some of them have to do with how powerful the heart is pumping. Some of it has to do with how well the heart is being oxygenated, and you can't really generalize from what's happening with the coordination of breathing to any of these other functions, and even less to the neurons that are related to the gut. or to the lungs, or to the stomach, or to other vital organs. So the vagus has many different functions, and this is just this respiratory sinus arrhythmia is just one. And sometimes, under very strict conditions, you can say that, well, it's a kind of a measure of average vagal control of heart rate, but only under certain conditions. It's not a very good, reliable index of average vagal control of heart rate, like how much the vagal nervous system influences increases or decreases in heart rate during a particular task or particular condition.
Okay. All right.
But in terms of well, go ahead.
No, what were you going to say? I'd love to hear.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, so what is the takeaway for those of us who are looking at HRV as a metric for vagal tone, for autonomic nervous system health? We're referencing our HRV score on our watches. Is this useful? Is it not useful? Does it tell us anything at all?
I mean, what it tells you is very ambiguous, I think. Much of the heart rate variability on smartwatches is trying to get at respiratory sinus arrhythmia. So they talk about heart rate variability, but I think very often they're attempting to assess the heart rate variability that's coordinated with respiration.
So can I ask a quick question there? If you're healthy, is your coordination better than if you maybe are like undergoing, if you're suffering from a chronic illness? Do people show impaired synchrony, like their respiration and their heart rate don't synchronize as well? Is that what it?
I mean, that's a good question. It's actually respiratory sinus arrhythmia. It doesn't measure the synchrony itself. It measures the depth of the wave. How much heart rate changes from inspiration to expiration.
Okay.
And that is sometimes a measure of it. Somehow is associated with certain health parameters. That's for sure, but not so strongly. And it's, as I mentioned before, it's not really a reliable measure of vagal control. We're not even sure that what we're measuring when we're relating health related parameters to health related measures to respiratory sinus arrhythmia is a function of the vagus or some other factors. Function of how well the heart and the lungs seem to get along with each other, to coordinate with each other, and has very little to do with the vagus per se. The idea that I have in some of my publications is that we've been really looking at the wrong place. We should go beyond the parasympathetic control, beyond the vagal control, and look at how the breath coordinates with other rhythms of the body. And
such as what? Like what other rhythms are there that it's coordinating with?
Oh, it coordinates with a lot of rhythms. It coordinates with brain function, with lots of different brain functions. It coordinates also with psychological processes that, in a similar way, with inspiration and expiration, changing your fine tuning of perception. The breath is an index of the largest oscillator, largest pump in the body. and it's a vital pump, and it's a pump that changes all the time. Physiologically, the pump is a pump also that has to adjust to the fact that I've been talking nonstop for the last 40 minutes, and I still have my needs to take in enough oxygen to breathe out enough carbon dioxide, and all the physiological functions of the body are uh, are dependent also upon that breath. And there are many other physiological functions like brain waves, like the circulatory system, that have their own rhythms, that have to kind of nest their rhythms within the slower rhythm of the breath. So my hypothesis, and I didn't want to go there really in this talk, is that we should be more looking at the actual physiological function of respiratory sinus arrhythmia, rather than focusing on his ability to give us a marker or an index or measure of vagal activity, which it doesn't do very well.
Got it. So to summarize, an HRV measurement, we don't need to get too concerned if our heart rate variability isn't where we want it to be, or if it is not moving in the direction that we want it to be, or we've been told that it should be moving in.
Yeah, and if you want to move it in the direction that you're being told that you should move it into, all you have to do is breathe slower, because you get more of it.
Okay, well, that's a good tip. So I would love to kind of bring it back to polyvagal theory and talk a little bit more about some of the other pieces that have been put forth by Porges. He argues that the polyvagal theory was never about anatomical exclusivity, and that the components do exist across species, but that mammals uniquely integrated vagal cardiac control, which we've kind of just talked about as maybe we're not talking about that quite right in the context of polyvagal theory. With the circuits that are governing facial expression, vocalization, and listening. And your co-authors are basically the leading experts in this area. So what does the evidence say about that specific aspect of polyvagal theory?
I mean, this idea of repurposing the vagus to serve mammalian social regulation or something. I think there's really no evidence for that. There's a lot of evidence against it. The idea that this kind of central coordination doesn't exist in other animals is just not true. That's one of the miscitations, the misrepresentations that is made in the original article that we were critical of. The one of our authors was cited as supporting the fact that this was a mammalian phenomenon, and in our article we pointed out that there's another article that from the same co-author of ours that was not cited, that makes the claim that this kind of central coordination just above the in the brainstem, just above the spinal cord in humans, is something that's found in all vertebrates, from fish to humans, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And then the whole argument about the special behavioral characteristics, the special social regulatory characteristics of and social behavioral characteristics of mammals as being radically different than non-mammal vertebrates is also not in accord with evolutionary specialists. So that, there's reptiles and fish and birds. They have very, very complex social behaviors, and not kind of passive defensive creatures that sit on a rock and just look for their prey, or defend themselves against another predator, for instance. I mean, they have, there's a lot of complexity in social behavior in non-mammals, and even the arguments that some of the other um, um, cervical nerves of the vagus serve uh, communication, or um, uh, uh, mouth movements. Of course, fish and reptiles don't speak, but the same cervical nerves appear to uh, to influence or contribute to jaw behavior or to tongue behavior in those animals as well. So there doesn't seem to be any kind of special developments. The best guess is that any differences between mammals and reptiles and fish is, has to do more with the fact that mammals went from more or less aquatic environments to terrestrial environments, and there had to be certain kinds of adjustments made that made their respiratory cardiovascular interactions a little bit different, just a little bit different than the other animals. So this doesn't seem to be much basis for uh, this idea of repurposing. There's certainly not been any proof over the last 3 decades of it happening, and it seems to be to my colleagues a very fatuous idea.
Right. Okay. So essentially, we can't say there's no evidence that mammals have integrated our wiring, so to speak, differently than other, reptiles and fish that have basically the same wiring and also display social behaviors that are, unique to those species, but, seem to be their version of what we do as mammals. Is that a
Yeah,
good assessment?
I think that's a good assessment without getting into the complicated
Right.
aspects of it. But I mean, I also think it's necessary to say that the evolutionary biologists that I've worked with and that I know make that as their case in this paper, their papers in 2022 in biological psychology. In my paper with E.W. Taylor in 2007, and these are the foremost figures and the actually white pioneers of evolutionary biology of the autonomic nervous system in the vagus. They don't buy this at all, and they certainly know the difference between structure and function, which is another aspect that Porges criticizes. If evolutionary biologists and neuroanatomists don't can't distinguish between structure and function, and then I think we would have something very very problematic with the whole area of evolutionary biology.
Well, and that comes back to the assertion that the critique is addressing some sort of different constructed version of, I think he calls it a synthetic version in his rebuttal of polyvagal theory. And as I was reading Porges's response, there was a lot of what seemed to me assertion that the critique was looking at a mechanistic version of polyvagal theory, whereas polyvagal theory is a functional theory, which, I'm just a practitioner. But to me, I was like, well, actually, my understanding is that polyvagal theory was seeking to explain the mechanism behind the clinical states that we observe in our clients. So that seemed very murky to me, but it seems like what you're talking about here kind of addresses that
I
piece
think,
of it.
I mean, I have, I find it also murky, and my co-authors who I sent the the Porges reply to when after our article was published, they also had trouble understanding what Porges was getting at, and either trouble understanding it or definitely didn't agree with it. Um, um, but they also said, let's move on, basically.
Yeah. And in terms of that, your paper's final conclusion states that the psychological observations associated with polyvagal theory, the states of safety and threat and shutdown, as you've mentioned, are real, and that they predate polyvagal theory and they don't require polyvagal theory. They stand on their own. So can you tell us, for those of us who are observing these states in our clients and we're coming to the realization that polyvagal theory is not giving us a framework for understanding the processes behind it, where do we go from here? What do we look at next? Where should we focus our attention to help us to ground our work in actual neuroscience and be effective, well-educated practitioners?
Well, there is a whole literature on trauma and these different phases of trauma or states. This is not something that was invented by or discovered by polyvagal theory, and there are very reputable researchers like Karen Roelofs in the Netherlands, and uh, Frank Wilhelm in Austria, that have been doing research on this stuff for a long time, on emotional freezing, on dissociation, and they have very refined kinds of hypotheses that seem plausible, and that are certainly within the boundaries of scientific plausibility. And I think, I guess maybe I'm old fashioned, but I think that old, that's for sure. But I think I think that if a therapist or a psychologist really wants to know something about or present something about the physiology, that they they ought to take a few weeks or a few months off, or maybe not even off, but they should take some time and read some papers and examine what the science has to offer. And of course, if we write our paper, we'll suggest that anyhow, and we can present some sort of backbone. But I don't want people just to believe me. I want them to take a look and to evaluate for themselves what the status of my arguments are, and uh, that, and there's literature out there. I'd be glad to come up with some with a list of papers if that would be helpful to your readers or to you.
Yeah.
And Uh,
I know I would appreciate it. I'm sure there's a few others out there who would as well.
so, does that answer your question? Or
Yeah, it does. I think that I'm looking forward to reading the paper. I do hope you put out that paper because I would like to read it. I'm looking forward to delving into other areas of research that help to understand this. Are there any particular theories or bodies of work that you feel are really well grounded, or is it just a matter of kind of looking at the science that's out there and piecing it together on our own?
even in terms of neuroscience, um, I think it's a big challenge to put together neuroscience and psychotherapy. Um, judging from my now considerable experience with recent and also past with physiologists, there's a lot that the physiologists don't know. A lot that they do know, but there's also a lot that they don't know, and and it's hard to navigate through the complexities of physiology to come up with a um, um, anything but a very very global overview of how body and mind go together. It's really a complicated thing. You have your brain, you have your cortex, and you have your middle brain, and then you have your brainstem where the autonomic nervous system is operating from, and then you have the sympathetic and parasympathetic nerves, and they go down, and they send their information down to the heart. But on the heart, there's another little brain. It's called, they're sometimes referred to the little brain of the heart, with all sorts of neurons scattered around the brain that either accept what's coming down or say, "Hey, wait, we don't want to accept that. We're going to block you." Right? Right? You're sending us information down to, you're sending us uh, juice down to slow our heart. We're going to ignore that right before the final synapse to the heart. So you have all these very complicated things. Not to mention with the vagus nerves that 80% of those 100,000 plus fibers are not going down to give orders to the different organs, but are coming up to give information to the sending it first to the brainstem, and then up to the middle brain and the cortex, and then kind of contributing to the next level of response to keep the allostasis or homeostasis in bounds.
What is
So,
the significance of that? So this is a fact that I'm aware of and find interesting as a body-centered practitioner, that there is so much information going from the body to the brain via the vagus nerve. And previously that segued well with my understanding of polyvagal theory. I'm curious what significance that has when divorced from polyvagal theory. What can we infer from that about the importance of information in the body and our ability to influence it?
I mean, it's hugely important, I think, and I'm the last one to say that the vagus nerve is unimportant, but it's a conduction system primarily, and I think in the last 15 years, this area of interoception has really taken off in physiology, and but it's also a very new area, and we it also has its complications because um, the just for the same reason that you can't talk about a general interoception taking place, that some of the neurons that are sending information back up are very specific to certain kinds of functions in their body. So it may be, how forceful your heart is beating, if we stick with the heart, how much blood supply is coming to the heart muscles, or how rhythmic the heart rate is, or how well coordinated um, heart rate is with breathing, or how well coordinated heart rate is with blood pressure control. It's complicated. Um, so I think it's in an early phase. I think it's very interesting, and I think uh, you could probably draw, also global kinds of inferences from the literature that's available. But it's all very new stuff, and in fact, I often think that unless patients or therapists are particularly interested in physiology, they might do well to really focus on the psychological interventions, or behavioral interventions, and and leave the physiological explanations to um, maybe not completely out, but tone them down a little bit, to really reinforce what we really don't know as well as do know about physiology. So you have a psychophysiologist here who's telling the therapist to stay with their lived experience. If your
Yeah.
heart, if your heart is it feels like it's bursting, they'll notice that burst and notice what you can do to relieve that burst, and you can begin to explain that bursting by something autonomically happening, but you never can be sure, and or rarely be sure, and the same. We don't feel our vagus. We feel our hearts thumping sometimes. We feel pain. We feel uh, nausea or uncomfortable feelings in our gut or in our stomach. We have muscle tension. We sweat. That's what we feel. We know that it has something to do with the autonomic nervous system control, but we don't know very much. And so why not stick to what we do know, and as opposed to, especially for clinicians, rather than just generating uh, theories that are not very helpful for anybody, and then also not helpful for the credibility of the therapy. Let's say
Mhm.
you have a you're really very effective with your therapy, but you're 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 claiming that certain things are happening physiologically because you think that's going to create greater credibility. But then the real scientists of the physiological world, they come say that's nonsense. Then you really throw out the baby with the bathwater. You
Mhm.
have a good therapy, a good treatment. Patients are really getting better, um, but you're discounted because because you attach yourself to an erroneous scientific framework.
Yeah, I think that's where there's a lot of tension for practitioners because there is the question of how does it work that comes up a lot. Clients ask it, other practitioners ask it when you're trying to explain your work to other practitioners who may refer to you or, want to learn what you're doing. There's always the question of how does it work? And it's not all that acceptable to say, I don't know. But I think that's what it comes down to is I have ideas. I'm inferring some things from what I know about neuroscience, but I don't really know exactly how things work.
And
And
the neuroscientists often don't really know how things work either. Really, I mean,
who does? Is there anyone who does?
I mean, they have some inkling, and they're researching it, and they're going, they're trying to accumulate a base of knowledge, but but things are still not, things are still not so clarified. But when I talk to my autonomic colleagues of late, they tell me it's incredibly difficult to explain things. Um, there's a whole area of vagal stimulation that's in medicine, not just the kind of exercises that are supposed to simulate the vagus that are um, in pop vagal psychology. But they stimulate the vagus, but they don't know really what they're stimulating, because there is an electrical stimulation that goes across a certain area of the vagus, um, and they're not stimulating the whole vagus. They're stimulating certain fibers, but they have no idea which fibers they're stimulating, and that's confounded by the fact that, according to this one uh, renowned autonomic physiologist with whom I talk, is confounded by the fact that the architecture of the vagus nerve as it's going down is very individual. It's like a fingerprint. It's not this the fibers are neatly packed and going down, and like if you had a cable of wires, for instance, that they're all straight and going down. They're all intermingling with each other, and you don't know which which um, fibers are sending information up, and which are sending information down. And he mentioned, I guess I could quote him. He said it's a nightmare. So within that, within a realistic perspective, you can still talk about the autonomic nervous system and what it's doing and what likely is happening. But we really have we definitely don't have the level of knowledge um, to expound a very, very detailed analysis of what's happening with somebody when they have a panic attack, or when they have a pain someplace. And we have ideas, and they're plausible ideas, and you can offer those plausible ideas, but you can't. It doesn't seem really legitimate or ethical to present explanations when you don't really have them, or when you don't know enough to be able to say it is that way.
This is just fascinating. I feel like I could talk to you forever and ask all these really cool questions. I didn't know that about the vagus nerve. It makes complete sense to me that it would be unique to each individual. That's incredibly interesting that we all have our own signature pattern in our vagus nerve. That's really cool.
Yeah, I thought so too. Even if it's a nightmare.
Right. Yeah, it doesn't really help us at all, but it is really interesting and cool. So, is there any other any final thoughts on this polyvagal theory paper that you put out, or any final words that you'd like to leave us with that you think we should know, or anything we haven't touched on that you feel is important?
I guess I would like to make a plea to the people who are invested or involved in polyvagal theory, and to let them know I'm not on, I and my colleagues are not on some sort of vicious trajectory of attacking Steve Porges or the polyvagal theory or any other theory. That's not our aim. We're really just interested in scientific integrity, and I would ask them to also consider that consider that possibility. That I'm not on some sort of negativistic attack. I mean, I have also interesting positive ideas that I have that kind of get weeded out in this discussion of the polyvagal because I think it is so actually so unhelpful and is polyvagal theory, and um, it takes people down the wrong path, and so that's one aspect. And then the other aspect I would plead to them is if even if they're you know um, highly invested, even financially or professionally invested, think about, maybe modifying some aspects of it so that uh, their ideas and their interpretations and even the name, so that they um, can speak the truth to their patients and to themselves, and that I think that's what I so admired by uh, your article in Substack, that you were willing to go out there and say, well, maybe it's not that way, and I think that I'm going to take these 39 experts or 38 experts plus their messenger uh, seriously, and I have a little expertise too, but not like these guys. Um, take their message seriously and reconsider what I'm doing. I think that's a brave act, but it's also very. I think in the end, it's a very nourishing act, because by you know by um, acknowledging that you've had the wrong hypothesis, it opens up things. It doesn't just close things down. It opens up other worlds, and it's a fascinating um, basis for further curiosity. So that's basically what I have to say. Thanks.
I think that's a beautiful message, and I think it's an important one. And I hope that I will see more practitioners opening up to a broader understanding and living a little bit more in the question of not knowing and being okay with not really having a complete um, explanation for the things we observe.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and it was a delightful conversation with you too.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate your time. I really enjoyed this. I feel like I learned some things. I have all kinds of new curiosities, and I'm grateful that you are willing to do this work and speak to us and help us to understand, what the reality of the science is.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate you taking the time. I hope this was helpful for you. I hope that you're walking away with more understanding, more comprehension. I know that I am. This was really interesting and educational for me. And hopefully this will allow us collectively as practitioners and as clients on our own personal journeys to move forward with more understanding of what we really truly know, what the science is actually telling us, and what still is a bit of a question. I will link to Dr. Grossman's work down below. He has a body of research that you should absolutely check out, so please do. And I will also link to my article and video on the polyvagal theory is untenable paper if you would like to look at those specifically. Please, if you found this helpful, subscribe. It really helps. Leave me a comment. Let me know what came up for you. I love to hear that as well. And I will see you in the next video.